Hello and welcome to Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast. I'm Scott.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Peter.
So sometime last week, Barack Obama made some at least nominally anti-woke statements, which is very interesting, although I found he does it from time to time. And I'm always very curious when Obama comes out and speaks on cultural issues and things that have to do with woke supremacy and all that. He basically admonished cancel culture, in essence. I mean, he said that it's a bad mentality, it's ineffective, and it's something that people should, I think, to quote directly, get over quickly, something that isn't productive. And it really got me thinking about him as a figure and how, to me, Barack Obama represents the most respected establishment figure in the Democratic Party. I mean, how could he not be? He's a two-term president, was fairly popular at the time he left office. So I wanted to ask, at what point, if any, are the tensions that exist between establishment liberals like Barack Obama and the sort of woke activist left, the hardcore progressive left, the woke supremacists, if you will? At what point are those tensions that clearly do exist between the two, at what point are those going to come to a head, if any?
Well, I think they are in many ways already coming to a head. I think the existence of, say, even just the IDW speaks to how inflamed those tensions have become. And there are a lot of people who, are still in the Democratic Party who don't feel at home in the Democratic Party anymore. And I also want to call attention to one other thing that he said, where he mentioned that there are good people who have flaws and that they have good work, and that you shouldn't cancel somebody because of some minor flaw relative to the incredible amount of good they might be doing otherwise in the world. And that displayed a nuance in his thinking that I think is lacking in a lot of the woke activists that we see today. And I think that, at least to me, speaks to the primary difference between these two groups, where you have sort of the establishment left with Barack Obama, say, as still an idol and a figurehead of that group that is capable of nuance, that is capable of discussion. And while they are still quite progressive, they're capable of a nuance that the activists don't seem to be capable of.
You could say that their worldview and tactics are compatible with civil society and civil discourse. I mean, that's basically what I'm hearing, is that Barack Obama made a point that any adult person should agree with, which is, I think, if I can quote him directly from what he said, from what I remember, was, some people who do terrible things love their children, which is actually a very, he's always been very articulate and a very good speaker. And I love the way he phrased that, because it's very true. People that do awful, awful things, you will see another side to them when they're hanging out with their children or their family pets or their wife. And that duality is one of the things that makes the world a more complicated place. And that's what Barack Obama was really touching on, I think, was the complexity of morality in politics, and especially in this very polarized world, how if you lose sight of that complexity, it can have negative impacts, not just on the world, but on the individual. Because he says you should get over that quickly. He makes this interesting implication that it's something that isn't going to serve you well if you view the world that way, because it is inaccurate. And I think that, you said that the tensions are already rising up, and I think that's true. I think the thing that happened semi-recently, where it seemed like the tensions were about to boil over between the two wings of the Democratic Party, and yet it didn't, because, of course, everyone's favorite current president, Donald Trump, kind of stepped in. But it was a moment where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was actually feuding very publicly with Nancy Pelosi. I don't know if you guys remember this. She implied that Nancy Pelosi was racist or had supported racist policies. And the official DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee Twitter account, said something about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which is unheard of. And there was about to be a moment where people had to take sides, and this was going to become a major rift. Then the go back to your home country thing happened, where Donald Trump was like, the squad is stupid, go back to your home country. And even though 3 out of 4 of them were born in the United States. And then, of course, everyone was brought back together around their hatred of Trump. And honestly, I think that was just a microcosm of what's going on between these two groups. I think that, when will the tensions blow up? When's the powder keg going to blow? I think what's holding together the Democrats is their shared hatred of Trump, is that, establishment liberals want to defeat him and attain power again. And woke activists think he's literally Hitler. Like they, for deeply rooted ideological reasons, want to get rid of him. So they kind of have this odd alliance, even though they are stylistically very different, just because they both kind of want to accomplish this shared goal of defeating Trump and the Republicans. But once Trump is gone, I don't know if they'll still have that.
But I think it's very encouraging that somebody of the stature of Obama is coming out and criticizing the kind of most extreme woke activists and reminding them that the world isn't just black and white, good and evil, and that there's good and evil kind of in every person. This is a very old idea, one of the foundationals in Western society. So it's, from my perspective, very encouraging that he's willing to go out on a limb and take this position and potentially even take some heat for it. But I think it does create kind of this cognitive dissonance potentially in the people who really revere him, but are also, say, more on the extreme left. How do you reconcile your love of this great man and this position that he's criticizing? And I think really anything that can make America think harder, or think about its the way it thinks, the way it makes decisions. I think that's a great sign for people who are worried about woke activism, that there are these major figureheads who are coming out against it, and it's not just the Donald Trump or the alt-right trolls or this Reddit page or whatever. It's actually people who are well respected within the establishment, trying to get kind of everybody to think a little more about what they're doing, their methods, their tactics, and ultimately what this can actually accomplish, rather than just creating more divisions, actually potentially creating something and making true progress as a country.
Yeah, my read of it, I hear a lot of optimism based off of, Obama's comments from you, Peter, but I'm like, you seem to think it was this really great thing. I think it was like a good thing. Like, I'm less optimistic about it, namely because he didn't lean into it as much as I would really want him to. Like, I think that woke supremacy is like a 5-alarm fire right now. Like, it's not the kind of thing you just once a year go like, yeah, it's kind of not the greatest thing. It is like, it is fucking up our institutions and our political process and our society. And so I would hope somebody as smart as Obama would see the extent of the problem, and I'm not sure he sees the extent of it. It is good that he sees some of it, but then the most important point I want to make is he is out of office. He's not currently in office. Generally speaking, being out of office gives somebody a big runway to use to make any particular statement. I mean, what is the consequence if Barack Obama says something that is anti-woke? Nothing. He's not running for re-election. He's not running for anything. So I think it would actually be a better sign to see somebody like Nancy Pelosi or Steny Hoyer or Chuck Schumer, major media figures. And from time to time, you'll see somebody say something like Chuck Todd on MSNBC telling Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez she shouldn't call detainment centers concentration camps. You'll see something like that. And I think that's more encouraging, because I feel like actually his stature almost makes it less influential for me, because it's like Obama is so safe that it's like, yeah, he can kind of just say whatever he wants. Like, I kind of want to see people start going out on a limb, because that tells me that once they're willing to put skin in the game, it says that they understand the severity of the problem. And Obama would be putting skin in the game if he went a little farther with it. But I think that his comments were he kept them within the realm of acceptable rhetoric, where, the woke supremacists won't currently go after you if you're Obama. Like, he kind of kept his level of social capital in mind, I think, and he didn't sort of overplay his hand as Obama. Like, because if he had come out there and been like, we got to stop talking about all the racism and sexism and identity politics, if he had taken any of their beloved buzzwords and criticized that, I mean, I guess cancel culture, but that is generally something that you can still criticize pretty openly.
Well, I think there's potentially two things that I would disagree with you there. One, I mean, he has really stayed out of the political arena, remarkably, especially given the current political climate. So I think the fact that he's chosen this idea, like this idea of the cancel culture and the woke activism, and just saying good people can make mistakes, good people aren't perfect, and we shouldn't expect them to be, and we shouldn't punish them for not being perfect. I think he does see the severity of the problem because of all the things going on in 2019 that he can go out and publicly make a comment about. He chose this one. So I think he is in a place where, even though he's not running for re-election, I mean, there's the Obama Foundation, there's a whole career that, you know, politicians of his caliber have after they become president. And if anything, it has potentially even more impact on their ability to sell books and to engage in nonprofits, to fundraise, to kind of be part of this elitist class that kind of helps steer the country.
A small club of former presidents,
right?
What, 5 of them? And
so I think it's potentially the consequences are even larger now than if he were in office. So maybe I see this as a much bigger deal than potentially you do.
It's also his legacy, right? Like you're saying. So he doesn't want, 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line that these woke activists are representing what he has brought to the country, right, over his time, because this sort of developed and was simmering during his presidency and exploded with Trump.
Yeah.
Now, I kind of agree that maybe his comments aren't going to revolutionize or kind of shift the direction of the Democratic Party. But at the same time, a lot of celebrities and current presidential candidates are latching onto his comments. Andrew Yang, Tulsi Gabbard have both come out and said this is what our country is about, and this is what a president should be talking about. The ambiguities of life and how things can be messy and how people make mistakes and flaws, but their common humanity is what brings them together. So I think it's been positive in the sense that people can point to like a former president as an example of someone who is representing a more moderate and a more tempered attitude in the country.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. And I kind of wonder, maybe this is a question directed at both of you. Do you think maybe he has a little bit of woke guilt?
I was just going to pivot to another question I wanted to ask that is maybe a prelude to that.
Okay.
So to answer your question, since you did ask it, Peter, I think he does have a little. I think that Obama actually maybe has started to reflect on the role he may have played in bringing the Democratic Party to the place that it finds itself. But I want to ask you both, to what extent did Barack Obama during his presidency contribute to the rise of woke supremacy and wokeness in the United States? It's a big question because it was 8 years of action from that president, and there were a lot of cultural things going on. The shooting of Trayvon Martin, the subsequent tensions, the shooting of the several of the Black Lives Matter things started to prop up at that time. That's when. So he left office in January of 2017. So that was Gamergate and the Ferguson riots, and I do think it's a major flashpoint when Sam Harris went on Bill Maher and got called a racist by Ben Affleck. This all these little moments that were kind of big flashpoints. They all happened during his presidency. And do you think that he in any way contributed?
Some people are saying that the rise of these far left ideas and the popularization of these ideas is a result of his presidency. I don't see that as much. I think that maybe it is the realization of his hope and change ideals, that now those ideals are becoming very commonplace, and people aren't afraid to say that they're a socialist. So not that he claimed to be a socialist, but maybe those ideas that were more heavily socialistic have become popular over time. But again, I think, and maybe this is part of the reason why he's not coming out in full force against woke activism, is because a lot of the ideas he agrees with, right? It's just the tactics that they're going about it are not bringing the change that he thinks would be most useful or long-lasting.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you, Jack, that I don't necessarily think he's directly responsible, potentially in any way, but perhaps indirectly responsible in ways, in that for a long time, perhaps there were these more radical leftists that had emerged in the Democratic Party, and ideas and institutions, and perhaps not enough was done to kind of rein in those ideas and to kind of prevent them from getting a larger audience, or even building them up. Where, I mean, it seems like a lot of the rhetoric on the left these days would be unthinkable 10 years ago. So perhaps, I mean, like, even looking back personally, I don't see anything that I would say he contributed to directly. But like you said, Scott, that a lot of the developments that have led to the current situation occurred under his presidency, and he certainly could have done more to prevent that and provide sort of the leadership, be the adult in the room, kind of rather than letting these tensions and this mess
fester
brew.
and incubate. Yeah, things kind of incubated during his presidency, I think, because I always say that this stuff really started to kick off in 2014, and he left office in January of 2017, and this stuff really started to kick off in late 2014. So there's only 2 full years, one of which he spent campaigning for Hillary Clinton, and he was obviously very focused on that, right? So he's very focused on defeating Donald Trump, campaigning for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So really 2015 was the only year where Obama may have noticed some of this stuff going on. And, we're talking about, did it happen under his watch? My position is it kind of happened under his nose. Like, I don't think the president isn't acutely aware of something like, say, Gamergate, right? Like, the president is not, like, right? He's deciding who gets struck by drones and what to do about ISIS and things like that during this time period. I don't think I'm sure he didn't know anything about Gamergate. And I'm sure that he wasn't watching Real Time with Bill Maher every night. He didn't see what happened to Sam Harris, or maybe he did, but he was just kind of like, whatever. But the one area where I would say you could actually draw a direct line between woke supremacy and Barack Obama was when it comes to the Black Lives Matter police stuff and the race victim narrative. Because he would deploy the National Guard for the Baltimore riots. It's not like he just allowed, utter chaos, but that's a low bar. Right. The thing is, when Trayvon Martin was shot, he didn't go out of his way, I think, to take an especially neutral tone. If I were him, I think the best thing, and look, hindsight is 20/20, right? But I think the best way for Barack Obama to have handled the Trayvon Martin thing would have been like, look, we don't know all the facts. This man has been arrested and charged, and he's going to be tried in a court of law. And I trust in our legal system to, provide the proper ruling. And of course, George Zimmerman was eventually acquitted in the death of Trayvon Martin. And anyone who looks at the evidence in that case can see that that was the appropriate. He was not legally guilty. There was just no way to convict him based on the evidence. And instead, that's not what Barack Obama said. He said, I understand people's, and, to give him some credit, he didn't go full, like, burn the fucker down. Like, he wasn't like, let's all riot and go crazy. He said, that he really understood the tensions and that he knows what the relationship between black people and police officers is, and that he got very personal. He said, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of started to make people go down the road where they came up with somewhat of a race victim narrative. I mean, it was just one of many factors, but I think Barack Obama's soft tone on people's hysteria around police shootings of black men, which if you listen to Larry Elder, who I recommend to all of our listeners, check out Larry Elder. But if you listen to Larry Elder, you know that the police shootings of black men are an incredibly overstated issue in the United States. Statistically, they are just not very common. And they're not, particularly concerning if you actually look at it from a statistical standpoint. I'll refer to Larry Elder for that. But I think that he contributed to that hysteria a little bit by taking a sort of emotional stance and saying something to the effect of, my son would look like this child who was shot and killed, which is tragic. It's definitely tragic.
It's also true. If he didn't have a son, I can easily forgive him for taking it personally. I mean, I think if that's what you're saying is his biggest misstep, totally forgiven, not concerned about that. I think also the Black Lives Matter is a tricky subject because perhaps when it started, it had more legitimacy. And maybe, and to your point, I think I agree with regards to the police shootings. It's an overstated issue, but I think within the justice system more broadly, there certainly are broader issues that need to be addressed. So I do see a fair amount of legitimacy in some of the aims of that movement. But I think what happened with that, especially during the election campaign, is, I mean, if you read the Russian election interference report, like the 12 most popular Black Lives Matter sites were all created by Russians.
Yeah.
And so it was this movement where it's kind of hard to say what is the movement and what is the election interference portion of the movement. And if anything, the election interference portion of the movement is so much larger than the movement itself in a lot of ways with regards to the content that is being put out, the memes, the kind of animosity that brewed. So I think that one specifically is a difficult it's a difficult topic to analyze because it has so many dimensions. Although, as I was speaking, I mean, it made me wonder: how much of all this, woke nonsense might just be attributable to the election interference and foreign governments creating websites, creating memes, and essentially trying to fan the flames of identity politics in the U.S.
I wish there was a way for us to know. But maybe if I were in the CIA, I would steal some files. But I want to circle back to what you said in that you feel like, if Obama's biggest misstep had to do with Black Lives Matter, you'd forgive him. And just say that I agree with you. Like, honestly, I look, in thinking about this question now, because I hear Ben Shapiro, who I really like. I like Ben Shapiro. I think he has really strong moments in this culture war. I think he's played a really key role, and he does a great job. And he's a great figure to have associated with the IDW. I think Ben Shapiro has very consistently tried to draw lines between woke supremacy and Obama that just aren't there. And he really hones in on this idea that Barack Obama, gave rise to the race victim narrative in the United States. But I think about it and I don't know, Barack Obama was a very dignified, not victim-oriented guy.
Yeah,
I don't, and I think that the thing that if I were to accuse Obama of anything, it would be not doing anything to stop woke supremacy. Yeah. But I can't think of anything he did to actively help it grow and incubate. I think he didn't know it existed. And I don't really blame him because, as I said, the stuff that happened pre-January of 2017 when he was in office was all stuff that could go under the nose, particularly of an incumbent president. Again, the incumbent president's not going to give a shit about Gamergate. That's a high bar if you want the president to read into that and with the future that told. It's not like he completely gave way to just utter chaos. He deployed the National Guard to Ferguson and Baltimore during the riots, after the deaths of Freddie Gray and Mike Brown. I think that what I would point to anyone who wants to pin this in large part on Barack Obama is think of the craziest things that have happened, the things where it's like, okay, a president needs to come out and make a strong statement about these things. They're all during the Trump presidency because Trump's election, I think, is what really set a match to this culture war and made it go into overdrive, like almost open warfare in that, it's after Trump is elected, by just a matter of a few weeks, is the UC Berkeley riots in response to Milo Yiannopoulos' speech. And that was something where the president did have to make a strong statement. And to his credit, Donald Trump did make a strong statement. And I would have expected Barack Obama to make a strong statement. But the thing was, he was no longer in office. Yeah. He also was no longer in office during the Evergreen stuff with Brett Weinstein. And he was no longer in office during the Kavanaugh, he hasn't been in office during the big flashpoints of the past 3 years.
So perhaps to take this in a slightly different direction, I mean, obviously it seems like in a lot of ways the election of Donald Trump is a major turning point in the culture war. But I feel like it's a response to the culture war that already existed, the divisions that already existed that had, in many ways, if they had not developed, then certainly grown larger during the Obama presidency. And so I wonder, perhaps, if we say, benign neglect might be the most, or neglect might be the most that Obama is guilty of, perhaps perhaps it is the disappointment with Obama in that he didn't take on the mantle as the culture warrior, as the the change that we're going to force through the system, and it's a reaction to that, as well, or partly a reaction to sort of the disappointment maybe more radical activists felt in Obama that we're facing today.
That's what I was going to say, because he was known as No Drama Obama for a reason. He was sometimes criticized for being too distant. A lot of people were saying that it was all talk and no action, and I think there's a lot of legitimacy to their points, and that the economy was bailed out to a certain degree, but who was bailed out during that time? And a lot of people felt all that money was going to the wrong place, and people maybe weren't thriving like they had been in the past, and so we get to this point where people are.
Well, you look at the emergence of even, say, the Bernie Bros, which maybe some overlap with the they're kind of their own set in the culture war, where there's probably overlap with, say, the woke supremacist crowd.
I consider them to be pretty damn aligned with each other. I don't really draw too much distinction between Bernie Bros and woke supremacists.
But I feel like the Bernie Bros are fighting the economic war, whereas
would you consider like Kyle
the
Kulinski? Do you know who that is? Secular Talk. Do you consider him a Bernie Bro? Or like, if you don't know who he is,
I don't know enough about him.
I know, but if so, I get the reason I brought him up is just because he's somebody who's not super into identity politics, but he focuses on the economics, right. And he is strongly like socialist-y left wing. Actually, I don't know that Kyle Kulinski is a socialist. I can't confirm that, but I know he's very economically left wing.
But I think there is a difference. I don't think the two groups. They have some overlap, certainly. I'd actually be really curious to research the overlap between the two, because there does seem to be some tensions between them, and especially back in 2016, where there wasn't really like the identity politics candidate in 2016 was Donald Trump, whereas Hillary Clinton seemed to be largely, maybe she played up the "I'm with her, I'm going to be the first female president," but it was relatively mild, and in general, I'm an established career bureaucrat. I know what I'm doing. I'm competent. And then Bernie was more the economic populist, and Trump was if anything he was the culture warrior in that election. So I'd be really curious just to see the overlap and potentially how that has changed, and if potentially one of the reasons it's gotten worse is if the overlap has increased in that sort of thing. We have this alliance between the Bernie socialist crowd and the woke crowd, and they're saying, oh, we're actually soldiers in the same war.
Well, I think one crowd is being terrorized by the other. I think that like Bernie Sanders is being terrorized, and his entire crew of fans is currently under the thumb and under the control of woke supremacists. And I would point to when what a beautiful metaphor for what happened to his movement. When the Black Lives Matter activists came to one of his rallies and they took the microphone from him and he actually let them speak. They were incredibly rude to him, and he should have had them removed by security. I don't think anyone could have faulted him for taking these people who had interrupted his rally and gotten up on stage and taken the microphone from him. Nobody could have faulted him for it, and what he should have done was had them removed. And Hillary Clinton had done stuff like that. Everyone's done stuff like that. If somebody comes up and takes your microphone, you kick them the fuck out. But he let them take the microphone. So, and what I see now is Bernie Sanders, with the second highest name ID in the 2020 Democratic primary, is sort of languishing permanently at about 15% in the polls. And he's losing to Elizabeth Warren with his own sort of cohort of economic populists, in large part because she's a woman. And I think that his whiteness and his maleness has been a huge disadvantage to him, and his age. If Bernie Sanders were 20 years younger, a woman or a person of color, just any one of those things, and certainly if he was 2 out of 3, he would be the 2020 Democratic nominee. I can say with 100% certainty that identity politics superseded his movement and transcended his movement. There was some overlap initially, and I think that it was a symbiotic relationship that turned into a parasitic relationship. I think that Bernie Sanders' movement will transform, will be engulfed. It'll be absorbed by the woke supremacist movement, and that we're seeing that currently. I don't think that it can survive the sheer power and the tactical brutality of woke supremacy, and that the destruction of Bernie Sanders is something that we're watching as he kind of languishes behind Elizabeth Warren in the polls.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting description of and what's happened to the left, and potentially why it looks so different now than it did during the Obama presidency. I wonder if there are any other kind of, say, major left-wing groups to which this has either yet to happen or is currently happening. So it's like you mentioned the economic populists. That's one group. You kind of have the identity politics group. It seems like also the left is party of, say, intellectual, cultural elite. That seems to be a crowd that's very on board with wokeness. I mean, we see it in many corporations, kind of large corporations that are having all of these quotas with regards to hiring and making sure that there's enough women and people of color kind of in every position at every level of the organization. So, I mean, it does seem like kind of what's the common thread through the the traditional alliance of the left. It does seem to be that that's the one idea that's kind of everywhere. Wokeness.
Well, and also anti-Trumpness, I think, which is in essence wokeness to a certain extent, is that Trump is a foil to wokeness in many ways, or wokeness is a foil to Trump.
I guess part of the point that I was making earlier is that I think in many ways the election of Trump is a reaction to wokeness, is a reaction to the political correctness that had been emerging for a while. I mean, you can paint a really pessimistic picture of like, oh well, we had a black president and he ran against a woman, and it just shows how terrible the country is. But perhaps a more charitable interpretation of the election of Donald Trump is that you have these cancel culture style tactics where they just go after and try to assassinate anybody's character, tear them down, paint them as a Nazi, even if they're just nominally conservative. And Trump was immune to that.
I would argue against. I've heard this notion a lot that Donald Trump's election was a backlash to wokeness. And I question it a little bit, and here's why. I will say this. If Donald Trump is reelected in 2020, it is because of wokeness. That is a guaranteed. The only way Trump wins in 2020 is because the Democrats have a stench of wokeness, and people are just running away screaming for literally anything else, and so they'll vote for Donald Trump, who is a historically poor presidential candidate, due to his overall lack of tact and candor and, frankly, ability to articulate any kind of coherent vision whatsoever. Not a fan. But anyway, if he's reelected in 2020, that is why. But I would say in 2016, I'm not sure that was the case. In 2020, leading up to 2020, I mean, it's 2019 right now, we see that the public is becoming acutely aware of woke supremacy in many ways. We have seen the media fuck up so many things, most notably perhaps the, Jussie Smollett, for one, hate crime hoax. And then another one with what happened at the Lincoln Memorial with Nick Sandmann and that Native American guy who banged the drum in his face. And they said that he was like the aggressor. The Mueller report, things like that. The media is being systematically discredited as new media like Philip DeFranco and Tim Pool and Subverse grow. And we see these major flashpoints after the 2016 election, like the UC Berkeley riots, all of the college unrest, the Evergreen stuff, the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, a series of things that I think have really made the culture war truly something that is universally understood, and people are aware of it, and they take it into account in their voting decisions. In 2016, I don't think the culture war had quite gotten into people's heads to the point where they would vote based off of it. I think it was mostly an immigration thing. I think a lot of Trump's support came from very, very nationalistic stuff that I guess is kind of connected to the culture war, but not as intimately as I think you might be saying, Peter, because the stuff that really, I think, kind of gave birth to the culture war as we know it, which was like Gamergate, the Ferguson riots, things like that. Those were obviously not major flashpoints of the 2016 election. And I don't think the people who voted for Trump were really aware of them. I don't think Trump's voters were, Gamergate advocates or, people. Because, look at the IDW, for instance. It's comprised almost entirely of people who voted for Hillary Clinton. Sam Harris, Brett Weinstein, Eric Weinstein. I'm struggling to think. I guess Dave Rubin voted for Gary Johnson, but there's zero Trump voters in the IDW because Ben Shapiro voted for Bubkiss. He voted no one.
That's right.
In 2016. So there's zero Trump voters in the IDW, for instance. I don't think his initial 2016 campaign was a backlash. I think that it was more so he ran a focused campaign that had nationalistic undertones and that was exotic and interesting to the Republican primary electorate. Then he engaged in what I would call a shotgun wedding with the Republican establishment, and Reince Priebus and the Republican Party pushed for him as hard as they could, despite pussy-grabbing comments and other obstacles along the way. And he faced a historically unpopular candidate in Hillary Clinton. And then he won a very close election, losing the popular vote. I do not think that is the narrative of a big backlash to wokeness, especially because wokeness simply wasn't that potent at the time, which is my main argument.
Also, Scott, I want to add on to your point to say that, and Andrew Yang has pointed this out, and that we're in the next industrial revolution. And so automation has taken away a lot of these jobs that people in the Midwest, in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania who are suffering from that. So I think that played a major role in them kind of favoring Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton.
Okay, well, it looks like it's 2-1 here, so I've got my
Although,
work.
I kind of question Andrew Yang's thing, though. I've always thought, I don't know. When I think about the profile of the 2016 Trump voter, I don't know how much they cared about automation. I don't know.
Well, I think there's a great post on Slate Star Codex, if you don't read it. Very big rationalist guy out from Silicon Valley. So he does all this long form research. And one of the most recent posts was about, do people care more about their social issues in society or economic issues? And by a huge magnitude, it is the social issues. It is their how they view society, how they fit in. They would much rather conform to an existing society, even at a significant monetary cost. So I think to the point about, was it primarily economic issues? I think Trump certainly brought up a lot of economic issues, but I think when people vote, it's probably more for social issues than purely economic issues. And I think the second point is, and maybe you see this, I see this more in Boris Johnson in the UK. Boris Johnson is somebody who's so easy to make fun of, and Trump is somebody who's so easy to make fun of, and in a way that serves to their advantage, because I feel like I've seen this over and over again. As politics has just become much more vicious, and everything is out there for forever, and so you have people digging through, finding some way to cancel you. I think these tactics have developed over the last decade. And when you have somebody who's just so ridiculous like Trump, or you have somebody who's just so easy to make fun of like Boris Johnson, there's so much ammo that it's almost like you have a hard time nailing them on that one thing. Like somebody like Brett Kavanaugh, it's like, oh, well, we found that one thing and we can make it all about that one thing, because really he had lived a pretty upstanding life.
He really fucking had.
Outside of that. And so it was so easy just to find that one thing. Whereas with Trump, it is every day he's doing something you can make fun of him. Like Boris Johnson, same thing. And it was he's purposely messing up his hair, and he admitted to it. And I think in a way it's a reaction to those cancel culture tactics that Obama is criticizing.
I was thinking Trump did run against the media in 2016. And I think maybe it was a backlash to perceived media bias by roughly half the country. And that is, again, pretty interconnected with the culture war. I feel like I think that people overstate how much Trump's election was. I think it was in part a backlash to wokeness, but only a small part, maybe 20% that and 80%, Hillary Clinton's unpopularity, his own stylistic, way of being, just how do I say this? It's like Trump was exotic and exciting. And he exposed just how demure, boring, and at times predictable and inauthentic other politicians were. People have to remember, Trump vanquished a cast of 16 other candidates, which included the son and brother of former presidents Jeb Bush, the up-and-coming Marco Rubio, the whatever you want to call Ted Cruz, whatever the fuck he is, and he vanquished them. John Kasich, the governor of a swing state, very successful governor. He vanquished them, I think, because he just was something else. I very much think that in the face of a world where politics has become so predictable and such a team sport, where everyone is a partisan hack and they're so predictable and you know exactly what they're going to say, there's a certain vote, there's a voting block that I would call the something else block. They just want something else, and they don't care what it is, but they want something else, something that is not politics as usual. And you saw that a little bit with Bernie Sanders, but you really saw it with Donald Trump. Because if Donald Trump was anything, it was exotic and different. He ran a campaign that was not like any before him, and it was truly historic. I got to give it to him. It flabbergasted the nation and has been really the most influential event of the 21st century in America besides 9/11. I struggle to think of almost anything else that has dominated the public consciousness, obviously with the exception of 9/11 and the subsequent, 9/11 leads to the Iraq War and whatnot. But I feel like, I think it was very much, but this is a good way of putting it. It was a cult of personality. It was about him. I don't think that he really represented a broader idea that was centered around being anti-woke. I think that it was an idea of being kind of a nut job, and that's what people wanted because it was something other than the demure and boring and predictable politics as usual.
How long have we heard this idea of the lesser of two evils? People feel like nothing's changing in the country, president after president, whether it's Democrat, Republican, nothing really changes. And Obama ran on hope and change. People thought, hey, maybe something different. He's black. maybe something new will happen. He's going to really, fight for the working class. And when, you can arguably say that didn't happen, people looked at Trump to say, well, now to your point, Scott, he's something different. He's a wild card. He's going to break through the this sort of malaise in politics and shake things up. And let's push the self-destruct button or whatever. Let's see how the cards fall. So I agree with that. And that does tie partly into the economic message, right? Because there are people that are suffering from the automation revolution. And, nothing happened under Obama. And a lot of those people voted for Obama. Then they switched to Trump. So I think there's a lot to that Trump, regardless of whether he was actually going to change anything, he was, again, another rhetorical sledgehammer.
I think I place more stock in the culture war aspect of it, because I think for a long time, and perhaps during Obama's presidency, and perhaps to Obama's fault, it almost seemed like there was a one-way culture war in terms of shitting on white people in flyover country. And Trump, why did Trump win? And it was because of Wisconsin and Michigan and these states where they really didn't have a candidate that ever kind of spoke to them. And really, the people on the coasts, particularly liberals on the coasts, they would just insult flyover country all the time. And it was just always making fun of the Christian white dude in Arkansas or whatever. And in a way, it was like a culture war that was just being fought one way. And Trump said, no, actually, you can't say this about these groups of people. Well, maybe he didn't say no. He said, you're going to shit on us. Well, we're going to shit on you.
Well, it's the idea of the deplorables, which of course was eventually became a co-opted non-pejorative phrase. It reminds me of Obama did once say something to the effect, and I want to say this was early in his presidency. He said something about there are a lot of people who will cling to their guns and their religion, very tightly. And I think you're kind of referring to that in that's a statement that clearly is pointed towards flyover country, white people who live in places where going to church and shooting at the gun range is a big thing, which I came from a town like that, but I was personally not like that. I was much more of the liberal persuasion growing up. I was more of an Obama guy. But anyway, I think that's That's an interesting point. And the thing that is so interesting to me about it is how the fuck did Donald Trump appeal to those people? Donald Trump is a billionaire from New York City. How in the hell was he the guy that managed to pull that off and bring those people into his coalition? How the ever-loving fuck? Like, you could tell me Ted Cruz, John Kasich, anybody else, and I'd be like, I get it. But Trump found a way to just play this kind of rhetorical magic. And I don't know how much of it was intentional or knowing, but, and I guess it was his salesman background that helped him do it. But a billionaire from the most elite of elite cities, coming from the most elite social class imaginable. He's not in the 1%, he's in the 0.1%. And he's from New York City, he's from Manhattan. And he wasn't even a self-made billionaire. You know, he was born into wealth. And he's the one who appealed to people who are riding tractors and shooting shit.
Well, I think you pointed it out earlier, Scott, in that he attacked the media, and who was the media attacking? And so he
enemy.
He came on to the defense of the people who had been accused of being racists and bigots and gun nuts and, you know, like irrational Christian conservatives.
And then they no longer cared if he was kind of an elitist. I think they no longer cared because he's not a Christian. He's cheated on his wife about 1 billion times with porn stars. You know what I mean? Like, this is a porn watching, you know, coke bumping motherfucking, you know what I mean? He is like a Wolf of Wall Street guy. He can't relate to these people at all. But it was very much a case, it seems, of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I think that he identified a common enemy between the Republican electorate and himself, the media, and the Democratic Party. And to a certain extent, the woke activists in their early stages. And he just won this group over. And it's one of the most bizarre things ever. Because can you think of anyone more unchristian, more unwholesome? Because when you think of like flyover country in Michigan and Kansas, like, it's wholesome. Trump is so far from wholesome. He probably doesn't know which end of the gun shoots the projectile. Like, he doesn't, you know what I mean? Like, he doesn't know anything about that.
Another part of that is he owned his flaws, and he owned the fact that he would buy politicians. He's like, I buy Republicans, I buy Democrats, you know, and people would say you're sexist, and he's like, and he owned that, and you know, he took ownership over these things, and I think that was so refreshing for so many people. And you might say, you know, a guilty Christian could be watching him and going, wow, you know, I'm so ashamed, and you know, I'm trying to hide my flaws, and here's this man who's just this alpha male, just going out there and telling it like it is.
And I really wonder, I think that the Democrats make Trump's profile and style a negative thing that they don't want to emulate in any way, shape, or form. I think they make it that to their detriment and to perhaps their eventual doom, because it seems like all they're going to churn out, if they really make it seem like we want to be the opposite of Trump, it's like, well, you can't be the opposite of him. There are good and bad things about his style. And I've always said this. Trump is wrong a lot, and he lies a lot, and he does a lot of horrible things, in my opinion. He also sometimes is the only sane person in the room, just because he doesn't have the sense of shame that all, you know, the Democrats have, and the sense of just ideological insanity surrounding wokeness, that, like, if they try to be the antithesis of him, they're going to just continue to be what Hillary Clinton was, which was a demure, boring, predictable establishment figure that no one in their right mind was enthusiastic to vote for. Literally no one. Literally no one was like, I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton. Like, nobody gave a shit. I didn't. I voted for Clinton. I didn't give a fuck. I was just like, she's not Trump, I'll vote for her. So, you know, I think the Democrats are putting themselves in a really bad position. And I want to pivot to a question about the Democratic race. One person that I think definitely contrasted himself with Trump was everyone's favorite woke white boy male feminist, Beto O'Rourke. And of course, he recently dropped out of the presidential race, you know, the world's smallest violin for Beto O'Rourke. And I just wanted to talk about something for a minute, which is, I believe, if I look at the Democratic candidates, at least the ones who were consistently in the debates up to this point, Beto O'Rourke was the only straight white male candidate who was not a septuagenarian. So if you take out Biden and Sanders, who are both quite old, Beto O'Rourke was the only like young straight white male. Pete Buttigieg is gay. Everyone else is either a person of color or a woman. So Beto, to me, represented the good boy straight white male feminist. You know what I mean? Because Biden but Biden's, you know, somewhat moderate, and Bernie's too old, and you know, he's stylistically very different from a, you know, 20-year-old male feminist. Beto oozed that energy, right? Am I wrong? It's like he oozed that male feminist college student energy in the ways he talked, about how like America is a white supremacist country and we're still racist and we gotta, you know, like yada yada. I guarantee I'm gonna have a female running mate. I think he said he made a pledge, and I just wanted to ask about that cohort because they crack me up at this point, particularly post Kavanaugh confirmation hearing. Anyone who's like a straight white male who's buying into wokeness, they confound me, because when somebody who is not a straight white male buys into woke supremacy and plays a part in it, I at least see the self-interest. Even if I think they're wrong, I go, okay, I see why they think of this as something that could benefit them. But this cohort of straight white male, you know, feminist, SJW, woke supremacists, whatever you want to call them, what is their deal and what is their eventual fate? What's going to happen to them? Because Beto O'Rourke's fate was he couldn't get it done because, frankly, a gay guy, Pete Buttigieg, came in and did his shtick better than him and had more intersectionality points. And I think that's so funny that Beto O'Rourke was he was taking up like the cool young white guy vote for a little bit there, because a lot of, I think, white male feminists seemed to be fans of his, from what I could tell of Beto's. And then Buttigieg came in, and he was like doing the same thing where he was very articulate and a good speaker, but he also happened to be gay. And I think that helped.
Well, I think, I don't know how much being a gay white dude actually counts for your intersectional
Not a
points.
lot. Not a lot.
Like, I don't think
look at Dave Rubin and what's his name? Douglas Murray.
I mean, and then, you know, there's high profile people like Peter Thiel too.
Milo Yiannopoulos.
And I don't know. I mean, I've always found the male feminists to be quite creepy. At least the ones that I know personally. Like putting it in their OkCupid profiles because they think it'll get them laid, and they admit that. They say, "I am doing this because this is what will help me with women," and it just makes it that much more creepy. Probably not the case for all of them. Just happens to be a few that I know, and that I find relatively horrifying. So obviously, Beto dropping out means that a lot of other people find this really creepy too, and just
well, I don't know if people found Beto creepy. I think that they found him inauthentic. I think it's very hard for a straight white male to come off as authentic. Somebody else who comes off as inauthentic and may drop out in the coming weeks is Kamala Harris. She's languishing in the polls. But people pointed out that the two of them in particular, I think, have been exposed as grifters. It's interesting because one is a black woman and one is a straight white male.
Yeah, well, I think, at least from my perspective, it seems to be very difficult to find, I'd say, authentic, you know, as you'd say, male feminists. And
I don't think they exist. Why would you give a shit? I really do. Like, first of all, feminism to begin with has issues. Even when women are feminists, I think they're wrong about a lot of things and that they have huge misconceptions. When a man does it, it's that much more suspicious, because at least when a woman does it, I'm like, okay, this provides you with a narrative and I see why it's comforting and why it makes you feel good and it makes you feel morally superior. When a man does it, I'm like, why the fuck are you doing this?
More importantly, when a man does it in 2019, when women have made so many strides, out-graduating men from college, out-earning men, at least in their 20s and kind of early career. And I think it's very difficult to see this as something besides being inauthentic and trying to potentially score woke points as as a white dude.
And the sexual element cannot be ignored. I will say, look, I'll be the first one to admit, when I was in college, I was never like a straight up like SJW, like super woke guy. I maintained a certain amount of my own dignity. I always made fun of how many pronouns there were and things like that. But I did have moments where maybe I'd post something about Trump or about the pussy grabbing comments, and some girl I liked in college would like it on Facebook, and I'd be like, oh, fuck yeah. Like a little part of my brain would be like, oh, I'm in. Like, and in retrospect, it was so dumb and it didn't work. But like I can say from experience that like that is a thing. Like I think that for some guys there is this. And actually, I think it also works for the racial stuff too, and I'll explain that. I think that there's a desire to be one of the good ones, right? So like guys hear women, and women talk about this a lot, especially in college. They talk about how terrible men are and how terrible the patriarchy is, and guys are like, oh, well, I can be one of the good ones. I can be like one of the white people who was part of the Underground Railroad. I can be like a good guy, right? And that will curry favor with this group that, particularly between men and women, there is a sexual interest in. I think it also happens to an extent with white people and black people, is that it's not a sexual element at that point, but there's an element of wanting to be one of the good ones. Is if you think that America's a racist country, you want to be in the Underground Railroad, right? So you're gonna do this thing where like you're trying to seem like one of the good ones, and I think that's the role they play in their head. Is they're like a freedom fighter. They're one of the good ones. They're part of the Underground Railroad. They're one of the male suffragettes. In their head, I think they're.
It's not 1919 anymore.
No,
it was 100 years ago. This would have been brave, and now it's. I mean, it's like what is it? These guys who go to the cuddle puddles. Have you heard of this?
Oh fuck!
I don't even know. It's not really a thing here, but it is in like Silicon Valley and New York and London. Yeah.
It's exactly what it sounds like.
Look it up
assuming.
because it's a way that I would say, by and large, kind of the I'll just be as stereotypical as possible, where all the male feminists go thinking that they will get laid, and it turns out to just be like 20 male feminists cuddling with each other.
Technically, they can still get laid. They're not wrong.
I question the motivations of I would say the men who would attend these types of events, and I think it goes back to the I want to be one of the good ones, and whenever I hear that, it just makes me think it's like what is so evil inside of you that you feel like you need to repent for it.
That's a great question. But the thing is, though, you're inundated. I'll say as the youngest person of the three of us, my experience was being inundated with patriarchy and white supremacy propaganda. That could mean the opposite of what I actually mean it to mean. So let me rephrase. My experience was being inundated with Black Lives Matter and feminist propaganda that I lived in a white supremacist patriarchy. And to some extent I was asking for it because I was a liberal arts major. So I kind of existed in that world, and I did take a gender studies class, but I had to. It was required that I take it was called the Diversity and Difference Gen Ed requirement, which meant I had to take either a Black studies course or a women's studies course. And also just like talking to girls, and also keep in mind my college experience was very colored by this stuff. Gamergate happened my sophomore year. The Trump election happened my senior year. Ferguson happened my junior year. So, I was just so propagandized with the notion that I existed in a world where I came from a place of privilege. Privilege was a huge buzzword when I was in college. I went to college from 2013 to 2017. I don't know. I feel like the buzzwords have transcended a little bit. I think white supremacy is used a lot more. That was something I didn't hear a ton in college. I started to hear it more recently after I've graduated. When I was in college, it wasn't white supremacy. It was privilege. Everyone wanted to talk about their privilege and how they acknowledged their privilege, and they had to atone for their privilege. And when you're inundated with those messages, there's a part of you that does feel a sense of guilt and also an opportunity to display your virtue by being one of the good ones, by like going up to a girl and being like, yeah, I know all about the patriarchy. It sucks. We got to smash it. And like, you think that that's going to, and I'll put it this way. It works to an extent. You know what I mean? Like there's enough of a false positive that you get from women being, liking your status on Facebook or saying like, oh my God, you're so right. Thank you. Or like, seeming like they're responding positively to the conversation they're having with you. But on a subconscious level, I think women, when it finally comes down to you wanting to bang them, I think that, which is the case with many of these guys, I think that what happens is, and it's very funny how this works, and I think this is the funniest thing ever. I think men who go super like woke male feminists to try and get laid will find that women like to be around them to hear what they want to hear, like to hear these positive affirmations of their feminist ideals. But that when it comes time to bang, when it comes time to choose who they're going to fuck, what they sense from you is that you are beta. You are telling them everything they want to hear. You've never told them no. You've never told them that they're wrong and that they should shut the fuck up because they've got bad information, which that'll get you like, I gotta say, if you actually argue with a girl and you do it well and you make her feel like you've bested her, sometimes that's what's going to get her interested in you. Because what she's sensing is that you have a certain degree of confidence and dominance. Because when you say things that are self-deprecating to men, including yourself, there's a certain extent of that self-deprecation and that sort of willingness to put yourself in a place lower than them, to say women are victims and I'm an oppressor, which really makes me higher than them on the power structure, but lower than them on the moral structure, right? And that if a woman feels like you're putting her on a moral pedestal, and thus a pedestal, she is going to feel that you're unsexy. I mean, by definition, you're giving her a certain amount of power that most women, newsflash, actually don't really want in a relationship. Most women are at least nominally sexually submissive. And I do think it's kind of ironic that guys think it's going to get them laid, but really they are advertising their deference to women and their, for lack of a better term, cuckedness, like their complete and utter obedience to them in such a way that is very sexually unattractive. But the irony is the messages they're being sent is that that's what they should do. I will say from my own experience, we are sent this message that if you want a girl to like you, you should share her ideals. But in reality, that's not the case. I think women see a man who has his own ideas, even if they're anti-feminist, and they might be more attracted to that. At least a good woman certainly is.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what you said there, and I think that kind of presents the challenge of, like how do you take a lot of these people seriously in their arguments, and because it does seem so colored by the self-interest and the motivation and I'm just like I have some ulterior motive, and I mean, I think you made the point earlier of, like if somebody stands to benefit from a certain set of ideas, or is perceived benefit from a certain set of ideas, you might not take them quite as seriously. Perhaps understand why they have those ideas, but not necessarily why those ideas are true.
This is part of the problem with taking on an identity. There's so much baggage with it. When I went to college, during our orientation, these two women who were leading it asked all of us in the room who was a feminist. And this was 2008. And there were only like 2 or 3 guys who raised their hands, and a good amount of women. And so it's funny thinking about your college experience. I'm sure there'll be a lot more hands would have been raised.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, during your experience. And
including by guys who know for a fact they are not feminists. A lot of them would have raised their hands anyway.
Well, that's the thing is I felt bad. I was like, should I raise my hand? I'm like, well, does that mean men and women are equal? I'm like, yeah, that's what I believe, but what else is there? So there's a lot of baggage.
It's a very
to these
loaded
terms.
question
It
at this
is.
point. The implication when somebody asks you that question is usually that you are either a feminist or a sexist. It's not. It has nothing to do with the reality of the political implications of being a feminist or not being a feminist.
That's the real problem.
Yeah.
I mean, you make it sound like compelled speech, right? Where you set up the kind of this false dichotomy between you're either a feminist or a sexist, and those are your two options. So, make your choice. But it's like it's a Hobson's choice. Like you don't have an alternative.
That became a talking point when I was in college. That was the thing I would see on like Facebook was like, at this point, you're either a feminist or you're a bigot. Like, it's just like, and and of course there was some backlash to that. That's in the early days of the culture war. You have somebody like June Lapine, Shoe on Head, who became a huge figure on YouTube for being kind of the premier, millennial woman who is anti-feminist. And she also happens to be physically attractive, and I'm sure that's a factor that helps her out. I think she's kind of the crush of many anti-feminist, including to a certain extent a 19-year-old me when I was in college. But yeah, it's such a fascinating phenomenon. And you said something about like, how do you take these people seriously, Peter? My answer is you don't. Like, I've reached the point where, and I want to recommend to our audience, when you meet people that are arguing from a purely ideological standpoint, they have no interest in truth seeking. They have no original ideas. They're just a mouthpiece for an ideology. And at the end of the day, the only reason they're doing that is for personal gain or to maintain some kind of false veil of moral superiority in their life. Like they're just trying to maintain this status as a victim in their own mind because it helps them cope with reality. When you meet somebody like that, just fucking don't even fucking bother. It's good to talk to people who have very different ideals than you, but at least they are genuinely trying to have a real conversation with you, and you can kind of tell when that's happening, in that they're clearly trying to understand your point of view, and maybe they're trying to reach a consensus or actually have a debate, and they're not engaging in like countless logical fallacies. But when you meet somebody that's just not coming from that logical discourse point of view, just don't even fucking bother. Just leave it. I have tried. I've lost friendships over this, and I don't mourn those friendships at all because, frankly, I've gained much better friends in my efforts to a certain extent, kind of ideologically, shift the circles that I'm in. I feel a lot more comfortable in the IDW space than I did in the liberal democratic establishment space, for sure. Yeah. But I want to ask a question that's kind of connected to this. And that's, one of the seemingly kind of unnatural allies, a sort of weird alliance that has emerged, is the woke boys, the straight white male feminists, and the woke supremacists. And they're sort of all woke supremacists, but it's still a weird alliance between these groups because of, as we said, the perception of there being no real self-interest for straight white males to do this, although we did identify perhaps a sexual element. But, there's the straight white males, but then there's also the sort of unwoke, or at least traditionally unwoke, establishment institutions such as the Democratic Party, which up until like 2015 was not really very woke at all. They had a very different style and way of existing. And also the media, which was traditionally this elitist institution that wouldn't give a purple-haired, facially pierced SJW the time of day for a long time. Is it possible that woke supremacists could at some point overplay their hand in such a manner as to alienate a lot of either straight white men or just these institutions as a whole, the media, the Democratic Party? Like, is there something they could do or that they have done to start that process or that they will do? What do you think?
I mean, if you described this situation to me 5 years ago, and all the events that have happened, I would have said, oh, yeah, that one, they overplayed their hand. That one, too, they overplayed their hand. And it's just been a series of events where I would think that any sort of reasonable person looking at this would see, no, like, the hand's been overplayed. This movement is over. So I find it difficult to comment on this because I think it's already happened over and over again, and yet there is something, perhaps a like religious aspect to it, perhaps a guilt aspect to it, something that's really much stronger that's driving it, rather than just the I don't know, maybe just like a superficial desire to promote change or to like have an impact on the world. It does seem to be, it seems to run a lot deeper than that, just given how much traction they've gained. Particularly, I mean, analyzing, like, say, what's been going on in the New York Times and the frequency with which certain terms are used, even in the New York Times, the state of the discourse in the media more generally, and the Democratic Party. I mean, on the plus side, I think it's helped contribute to an ecosystem of alternative media. But yeah, I would say
Yeah,
they
I mean, you're
overplayed their
basically, yeah,
hands.
no, you're saying like it's kind of already happened, and I think there's some evidence of that in that you see what is the IDW, but in many cases, refugees of the progressive movement. Sam Harris, Brett Weinstein, Eric Weinstein. I know there are others, but I always forget the others. There are many very progressive figures in the IDW. Harris and the Weinstein brothers being the clearest. And also, Dave Rubin was formerly a strongly progressive person. I was formerly a very progressive person. Not that I'm a major figure in the IDW, but, you know, I'm just an example of somebody who has apostatized from the Democratic Party. So you do see some kind of exit occurring. Now, with people like Jonathan Haidt, that's another one. You know, with people like Jonathan Haidt and Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein and Eric Weinstein, they're still partisan Democrats. They have not left the Democratic Party the way that I did or Dave Rubin did. But you are seeing that to an extent. There's already some backlash. And also, I mean, you saw a decent amount of Democrats. I think more Democrats voted for Trump than Romney, I believe. He got more crossover votes, I think. And yeah, I think that you are starting to see a reshaping of the political realm. I think that the problem right now, for certainly if you're coming from the maybe Ben Shapiro's point of view as a partisan conservative Republican, Trump, I think, is preventing a full transition. So like someone like me or Sam Harris, we are never going to be Republicans as long as Trump is the leader of the Republican Party. We may be, I'm an independent now, and Sam Harris is, I guess, what you would refer to at this point as a moderate Democrat, as is someone like Jonathan Haidt, and I guess maybe even Obama at this point. But none of these people could possibly ever align themselves with Republicans who are presenting an alternative, right? It was Republicans who got Brett Kavanaugh confirmed to the Supreme Court. At times, Republicans are the firewall between woke supremacy and the rest of society. That's just undeniable, that they are at times providing the defense. I will say this as somebody who has no love for the Republican Party, and certainly not for Donald Trump. They are at times seemingly the apparatus or army with which to provide a firewall or a defense against woke supremacy, particularly when it comes to something like the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. And yet their recruiting efforts are going to be really, really hampered by Trump's status as the current president and leader of the party. And so I feel like, although it could also be a good thing though, because what we're finding now is that a new center is emerging, right? It's sort of like people who are politically homeless, which is really where I exist at this point and where many people exist.
I hope so. I'm still thinking about, is there a specific event that I could see happening?
For me, it was the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings was the end of me and the Democratic Party.
But I think there's a deeper problem going on, and you mentioned this before, in that the school system, the universities are cranking out these people year after year after year. And yes, people potentially as adults realize, okay, well, and this happens to everyone, right? Like Santa Claus isn't real. We learn that like at some point in our lives, and perhaps we're learning that what we're presented in Hollywood, what we're presented in the New York Times, what we're presented kind of through the all the blue church institutions isn't actually true. But it's a much slower process than sort of the default mode, which does promote all these ideals, whether it's Hollywood or whatever else. So in a way, it almost seems like without an alternative set of institutions for people to really be raised through, it's almost depressingly like a losing battle in terms of the numbers. In that, if you're kind of recruiting more people to the activist woke movement every year, it's how you have to sort of take them out of that at a much faster rate.
I want to provide like a kernel of hope. And that's this. I agree. It is really looking very scary. I've always said this woke problem is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. It's going to get bad. It's going to get really, really bad. And I want people to really hear that. It's going to get, if you think it's going to start calming down soon, it is going to get, for the next like 5 years, I would say, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. But then sometime in the next 10, 15 years, I think, what we'll find is that the collapse of the legacy media and the collapse of traditional educational institutions, because people are going to stop going to college. people are waking up. They know college is a scam. They know the mainstream media is a scam. These institutions that are cranking people out, as you said, into woke supremacy, into woke supremacists, I think that factory process is going to be disrupted by, to a certain extent, the IDW, but also what the IDW exists as a broader part of, which is the new media landscape. Exhibit A, PewDiePie. PewDiePie has 100 million subscribers on. That is insane. So that is a not insignificant fraction of the entire world's population. I won't do the math right now, but just for perspective, there's 7 billion people on Earth. 100 million of them, of everyone on Earth, is subscribed to PewDiePie. And I actually happen not to be one of them. I don't love his content. But anyway, PewDiePie has a legion of particularly young boys who watch him and develop a politically incorrect set of ideals, and certainly a politically incorrect set of a sense of humor. And Steven Crowder has 4 million subscribers. Joe Rogan has 7 million. Philip DeFranco has 6 million. Dave Rubin has 1 million. I think that if the alternative sense-making collective that is essentially the IDW and everything it's associated with, even something very tangential like PewDiePie, who just has by far the biggest audience, if that can break through, it can win the day. And I think that we see it breaking through some of the time. We see people waking up and it's almost like they're coming out of the Matrix. And that's how I felt. You know, it's why they call it the red pill, right? That's the origin of that statement, is that people are getting red pilled. Look at Lacey Green. She was somebody who was a hardcore feminist and became at least nominally IDW associated. Somebody like Candace Owens, her original name was Red Pill Black, because she is changing the way black people think about politics in America, for all my disagreements with her, and I have some. But I think that those institutions that are like a woke supremacy factory that creates woke supremacists to a certain extent, they're breaking down, and that something else is emerging in its place. And if we can just hold on long enough and keep fighting long enough to supplant that system, that eventually reason can win the day.
Yeah, it's my hope that this silent majority of people who don't buy into the woke culture, even with Obama's comments, and this is a positive thing in that a lot of celebrities and politicians have come out to say they support what he said. And would they have said that otherwise? They wouldn't have come out on their own to say, woke culture, throw it away. You don't need it. Get over it. Grow up. But because he went out and said that, it gave them a little more encouragement, incentive to actually hop on this bandwagon and not be labeled as alt-right. So part of that culture war is going to we need to bring in people that don't align with us politically. And it's essential. Otherwise, how is this war going to be fought?
And those alliances are appearing in the IDW. The fact that Ben Shapiro and Sam Harris are aligned in this fight is hilarious. I mean, it's amazing. It's fantastic. It's amazing to see such an unlikely alliance arise. And it's because of how truly awful all the woke shit is, that it could bring together people of such disparate worldviews. Because again, like we were saying before, it's all about a common enemy. And right now, I mean, this is like, it almost reminds me of like the movies where like the aliens attack and then every country, like Russia, China, America, like nobody cares anymore. They all just fight the aliens. And I think that the woke supremacists are like aliens. They want to fundamentally transform humanity and socially engineer us in a way that will destroy us and destroy our freedoms. And I think that every country, like in the alien movies, like every single faction that is not them, the classical liberals, the libertarians, the conservatives, the moderate progressives, the politically apathetic comedians who don't want anything to do with politics, who never bring up politics in their set, they just want to make jokes, they're joining the fight. Legion of Skanks, which is a podcast that I really, really like. It's very politically incorrect. They were talking the other day on their podcast about how they didn't take kindly to being called conservative radio in an article that was written about them. Because I don't know if you've listened to them. They are not fucking conservative. They are pot-smoking atheists. And they were called conservative because they make, to be fair, they make a lot of rape jokes and politically incorrect jokes. But just the fact that they tell politically incorrect jokes put them in the basket. with everybody else. And it's creating a rebellion that I don't think woke supremacy will be able to contend with, because as they alienate more and more groups, including completely politically apathetic people, somebody like Brett Weinstein, who just wanted to teach biology, he didn't want to have any, you can tell he doesn't care about politics. He cares about science. Eric Weinstein said it himself. He said, I didn't give a shit about this. The man who coined the term intellectual dark web said, I didn't give a fuck about any of this until they came into my lab.
So to present a pessimistic take on this, everything that we've described so far is it's like green shoots. It's like the beginnings of potentially something. Like, how do you compete with the money in Hollywood? How do you compete with the money in all the big colleges out there?
Peter Thiel. Some people think he's actually behind it all. There was a really interesting theory that Peter Thiel's like behind the IDW. It was on the shout out to the intellectual dark web subreddit, which has also been very kind to us. But what you're saying is we need some structure and we need some real movement and we need some resources behind this movement. And I agree.
I think it needs to be much broader and much deeper, in that it's, like if people start, I get compare, PewDiePie, big audience, lots of followers, but I mean, people aren't going into a classroom and interacting with other people with, the ideas or whatever else. It's a very limited, it's a very limited sphere, and it doesn't kind of naturally serve itself to kind of fostering deep ideological, deep interpersonal ties. Whereas, I mean, if you go to, one of these marches, you go to one of these groups, these protests, that's a really great way of forging strong ideological ties. And I suspect, if people are like, well, they're exposed to it and they see the community around it, and then they're welcomed to be part of that community, it's a really powerful kind of set of tools that they have for both spreading these ideas and building a community and building strong ties around those.
Yeah, I think that I've talked about before how we need to create a worldwide safety net for people that want to tell the truth, because telling the truth is so dangerous right now. I mean, we take a great risk just in broadcasting this podcast. I mean, it is something that could very negatively impact my life, with my employer and with certain people that I know. But the IDW has created at least a nominal safety net, in that you see somebody like Brett Weinstein or Jordan Peterson, I mean, not just surviving an attempted canceling, but thriving in the midst of one. Now, of course, Brett Weinstein has made this point, and it's a very true thing and something that people should keep in mind. That is not the likely outcome. For every Brett Weinstein, there are 100 people or 1,000 people that got canceled, and they didn't become, best-selling authors like Jordan Peterson. They just said they didn't want to use a pronoun, got fired, and fucked off to live in poverty and get divorced. That's what happened. And so there's an appropriate level of risk assessment to do. And I think that to go back to what you were saying, Peter, we do need to create a social infrastructure for people that want to fight this fight, because there needs to be some kind of stated goal or mission and some organization. I do think that there needs to be a real apparatus with which to fight woke supremacy, and one that has some central figures that are willing to lead the charge and sort of like give the marching orders, because it is getting to a point where it's pretty much open warfare, and you can't just fight it with these sort of disparate little, a podcast here and a podcast there, Like, at some point there needs to be a full-on political movement. And to a certain extent, the IDW is a political movement, but it is lacking in certain areas.
Well, to continue my role as Mr. Pessimism today.
God.
So I like the point that you make about, fighting for truth and truth seeking. But I wonder, looking at human history, like kind of truth seeking hasn't been the default mode for a lot of people. In a lot of ways, like, I feel like we are kind of the radical ones actually looking for truth and not just essentially selling people lies through marketing, propaganda, politics. in fact, those seem to be the norms. It seems like the tactics that we're seeing emerging in the culture war, both on the left and on the right, kind of these these narratives of collapse, of being under siege, of just everything's going to hell tomorrow. Like this is what people have been sold by their leaders, by society at large for a very long time, and the institutions for seeking truth, for promoting that, are still, they seem relatively nascent, and because they're so unpopular, because they're uncomfortable for a lot of people, actually really difficult to maintain.
Yeah, I think that there needs to be an effort to present truth making as the noble and frankly correct way to live your life. And I think that the person who's done the most in those efforts has been Jordan Peterson these past few
very
years.
Much follows in in the ancient traditions. Sort of
Yeah.
Know thyself. Right? Like align yourself with truth, overcome self-deception. These are classical themes of generating wisdom, but they're hard.
Yeah.
But they're really difficult to sell to people compared to the alternatives.
I do think that, I think of it this way. This is like a metaphor for what I think the IDW has done to a certain extent. I think that the totems that represent truth seeking, the ancient texts that tell us how to live a good life, whether it's the Bible, the Torah, the US Constitution, what have you. I think those have been, I would say let's say they all existed in the same place, in a national archive or in a worldwide archive. And this is a metaphor that I'm trying to explain right now. And the woke supremacist, took over the institutions that run the archive, and they gave an order to burn it down. And the IDW ran into that burning building to recover the texts and is running off with them and trying to protect them with their lives. And what I mean in this metaphor is that there's a way to advance human society that we have been incredibly successful in doing. We have accomplished amazing things. The fact that I am speaking to you right now, listeners, is fucking incredible. The fact that we are growing an audience of hundreds of people, soon to be thousands, maybe tens of thousands or more. It is absolutely astonishing, and it is beautiful, and it is a great accomplishment of mankind, the way that we are able to share ideas with each other, with you now, and as many others are able to do, including others within our IDW cohort. We have ideas that help us shape a worldview that leads to these kinds of results, to the advancements in medicine, in governance, in creating a prosperous and a peaceful civilization. We have a rubric for that. We have several rubrics for that. And woke supremacy is going after that and trying to destroy it and replace it with something terrible. And I think that people in the IDW are safeguarding those ideals and trying to protect them from an onslaught from the woke supremacists. And somebody like Peterson in particular really, really, I think, fundamentally understands these things and is sharing a worldview with people that they can't hear at school and or in the media. And I think the IDW is doing that as a whole. And I think that we've got to embrace that role and just make sure that those ideas are not only maintained, but expanded on, because part of that process is constantly coming up with new ideas and new ways to help build up human civilization.
I like the analogy that you made, and I think Eric Weinstein made a very similar point in that, particularly, when you say it's sort of these ancient texts are safeguarded in a building that's been lit on fire.
Yes.
I think he almost, he doesn't use the exact same words, but he kind of makes the same point about, universities are about building knowledge and spreading wisdom. That's their foundational purpose, and they've been taken over by the activists. And they've become a tool of activists in a sense. And you have one department of the university trying to overthrow the wisdom and knowledge seeking parts of the other one. So when he makes the comments like, "Get out of my lab," that really speaks to the heart of what you're getting at, in that, especially by getting into the universities and changing the politics of the university to disparage wisdom and truth seeking, they really are kind of going at the heart of how these ideas not just spread in the current world, but between and among generations.
And it's so crazy because what they'll use, because you would ask them, like, why are you trying to destroy these institutions that have built us so far? And they'll say, because our society is shit, because it's racist and sexist and oppressive. And they're so blind to how amazing it is. This is another thing Peterson talks about. I know we bring him up a lot, but there's good reasons for that. Peterson makes the point of, like, we're fucking chimpanzees, okay? Look what we've done. You can walk down the street and you can trust 99.9% of the people not to attack you. You know, like, you can just exist with other human beings of all different colors and religions and ideals and coexist with them in a society where that is built to protect you. We have things like, you know, first responders ready to help you at the literal press of a button. We have a fully functional society that has built a beautiful, amazing thing. And I just think it's so funny that if you were to ask the woke supremacists, why are you burning that fucking building down? What the fuck are you doing? They would say, well, we got to burn it all down. This society sucks. Let's replace it. And what that demonstrates to me is something that doesn't get brought up in this conversation often, and that is the ingratitude. Oh my God, the ingratitude, the ignorance of these people to be so ignorant of what life was like just 1,000 years ago, which in the grand scheme of things is nothing. The world has existed for what, billions of years? 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago. How horrible life was for so many people.
Well, if they read any of those books, then they would know.
And they say it's not good enough. God, the ingratitude when they say it's not good enough what we have. It needs to be more equal and more fair. And it's like, it is trending in that direction. We live in a pretty great world that is constantly improving. You're taking the processes that have made it improve, basically the processes that gave women rights, that gave black people rights, and you're destroying those processes.
So, Scott, are you saying that you actually believe the motivations that these activists state they have? Because that's something I gave up on.
They don't always state it. They don't always state it. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they do. A lot of times in the academic world, they actually are fairly articulate in stating this exact goal. But outside of the academic world, you see a lot of couching one's motivations in more of like a traditional civil rights fight that is not based on subverting society, but more so freeing a set of people in society that are oppressed. Whereas I think you're right. Sometimes, particularly in the academic context, there's actually a very overt statement, which is we want to supplant this society with another one. And that is a truly horrifying thing because this society fucking rocks.
Well, I mean, the greatest force for progressive social change in the history of humanity has been Western liberal capitalist democracy.
Yep.
And to think that, well, I know better is remarkably just a combination of arrogance and narcissism and just ignorance. And I think, you know, if you actually study the kind of the history of these institutions and the problems that they solved and sort of why we need to protect free speech, why we need to protect due process, we have really good reasons for that. And if you study those, then you'll know here is what works. Here's what works really, really well. And here is maybe what we might need to change. And somebody like Obama, who's very articulate, I think can make that case very intelligently. And I think he understands, even though I potentially disagree with him on a number of policies. But I think the activist class really never embraced that point.
I like the metaphor that you use, Scott. Because Obama is sort of sitting there in that building, in that institution, and he's trying to safeguard it. And he sees his woke activists coming in there with their matches, you know, ready to burn it down. And he's like, hold on. We can rewrite these books in a different way, right?
He knows about those institutions. I think he has a JD in constitutional law. Obama is no slouch when it comes to his knowledge and his intellect. So he knows those institutions. He knows. Obama knows why freedom of speech and due process are important. And I God, what I would give for him to really come out against this stuff. I mean, I know he did to an extent with cancel culture, a little bit, but God, what I would give to have Obama join the IDW. And I guess one thing I want to say about that is like, can we not alienate somebody like Obama? Because I feel like I'm a little afraid that somebody like Ben Shapiro couldn't reconcile that. Although I don't know. Shapiro has sat down with people like Andrew Yang and Neil deGrasse Tyson in such a manner that I believe he would be happy to have a similar conversation with Barack Obama. But I think that, I'll put it this way. Somebody like Shapiro blames Obama for woke supremacy at their own peril. We need someone like Obama in this fight. And he did stick a toe in it recently, just to kind of bring things full circle to the first thing we talked about today. And man, what I would give for somebody with cloaked in the immense power of Obama's public image and level of influence. What I would give for somebody cloaked in that power and that influence to be a part of this fight on the right side.
But I would say that what he did, at the very least, is helping. And the other thing I want to mention is we're not seeking a political solution specifically. I think you mentioned that earlier, that maybe we'll need political action. I think maybe only in a free speech manner, but not in an institutional level. Because earlier I was thinking in a hypothetical scenario that a establishment Democrat gets elected, right? And all of a sudden the media is going to make a turn, and they're going to try to defend that candidate against the woke activists who are going to say, like, you're not doing enough, you're not enacting this policy.
Sounds like Biden.
Right? So if Biden gets elected and then the woke activists come out after him because he's not really changing anything, they're going to come out against the woke activists possibly because they don't want another populist to be elected in the next election. But it's too easy in a way, because what we're trying to do is create a grassroots movement. And again, we're working in the world of ideas, not in the world of institutions necessarily.
Yeah, what you said makes me think about how we are watching an important proxy battle, an important little skirmish in the woke wars right now in the Democratic primary. I think that Biden represents something that is within a standard deviation of like a normal fucking president, and that if he loses to Elizabeth Warren, and I think it's more likely than not that he does, but I'm not sure. Maybe he'll win. I think that is a big moment for the Democratic Party if Elizabeth Warren. People, 6 years ago, if you'd asked anyone if Elizabeth Warren, after she'd been elected to the Senate, could ever run for president, people would be like, yeah, she'd be really popular with like the crazy activists, but I don't think she could ever win a general election. That doesn't seem to be a problem for her right now, because she is now the norm in the Democratic Party, and Biden is kind of an old dog, kind of a being left behind perhaps. But, it's only November of 2019 right now, and the voting doesn't start until February, so we don't know yet. But I do think that we're seeing an interesting fight. We're going to talk about the Democratic primary more as it progresses, because I do think, as much as we don't always want to talk about electoral politics on this podcast, because it can be a little redundant of what you'll see in the mainstream media, and we try to talk about things that are outside of those kind of horse race conversations, it is relevant, because the battle between Biden and Warren, I think, to a certain extent, is a battle between woke and at least nominally normal, liberal politics. And it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. But for now, I want to sign us off for today. This is Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast. Thank you so much for listening. We recently crossed over 200 subscribers on YouTube. This is only our second month of broadcasting, and so we're really, really excited. We are on Spotify. We are also on iTunes, and I believe we're also on Google Podcasts. They put us up on there, so you can listen to us in a lot of places. But please subscribe to our YouTube channel here. Please like this video. Let us know what you thought of today's episode. Again, this is Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast. Thank you for listening.